Okay, here we are, February 20th, 2021. Time's gone by. We're starting out a new series. We had talked last time about how we would be discussing the prophecies in the book of Daniel. And so we're going to look at that. We're going to be looking at, in what will probably be a two-part series, the chapters that are critical to Bible prophecy. Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 9, maybe a little bit Daniel chapter 8. We're going to compare some of that to the book of Revelation. So this is critical because these passages in the book of Daniel make reference to and relate to a period of time when God reveals to Daniel and has put into the Bible 500 years before the birth of Christ, a prophecy related to the rise of the Antichrist, the establishment of the Antichrist kingdom here on the earth. And if we are, and we believe that based on all the signs that we've seen, we talked about the rapture, we talked about the Feast of Israel last week, and how they might relate to a possible springtime rapture or maybe a fall-time rapture, possibly even this year. We're going to be talking now about the book of Daniel and how Daniel laid out for us a series of prophecies wherein God revealed the establishment of a series of kingdoms, and that those kingdoms would end with the establishment of the kingdom of the Antichrist on the earth, and that period of time will run for 7 years, and at the conclusion of that 7 years will be the second coming of Jesus and the establishment of the millennial reign of Christ on the earth, which would continue on for 1,000 years. So we're going to be looking at those things today. Daniel, just to give you a little bit of background, was an individual who was in captivity in Babylon. And so when we talk about Babylon, and we talk about Babylon a lot, we want to clarify the difference between the ancient Babylonian empire of Semiramis and Nimrod, where in the mystery Babylon religion of worshiping the Queen of Heaven, worshiping the Sun God King, and the counterfeit of the Trinity of God. That's established back shortly after the flood of Noah destroyed the whole world. When the world was reestablished, we had Nimrod establishing the Babylonian Empire. It isn't until centuries after that that Abraham is called out of Ur of the Chaldees. He's led into the promised land. We find out that Moses comes along, leads Israel out of the Egyptian captivity, receives the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. And it's at that point that the kingdom of Israel, which has now been ruled over by King David, followed by King Solomon in a series of kings, encounters a period of time wherein God, and we talked about sevens and how 7 is a special number in the Bible, number of completion, 7 days in a week, 7,000 years in the millennial week of human history that we've talked about in the past, where God sees one day as 1,000 years. So if an entire week, which is a completion of a set period of time, it's 7 days, in God's eyes it's 7,000 years, or in our eyes it's 7,000 years, and in God's eyes, go blue, it's 7 days. And so we see 7 being a very important period of time. 7 was also important and was critical in the establishment of the neo-Babylonian Empire, when King Nebuchadnezzar came along and reestablishes the Babylonian Empire that had passed away. It was referred to as the Neo or New Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar is a pagan king, and what God did was punished Israel. Why? Because Israel had deprived the land of its Sabbath day's rest. And so every 7th year, there's that number again, 7, every 7th year, Israel, under the law of Moses, was supposed to give rest to the land and not grow any crops. And remember, we've talked, Israel was an agrarian country. We now know, based upon agrarian science, that if you continue to grow the land and you don't leave your land or one of your fields fallow, you'll leach all of the minerals and nutrients out of the soil, and you won't be able to grow anything. So if you're a farmer, I grew up in Michigan, there was lots of farmland, and some of my friends were involved in farming, and I knew that they would have more than one field, and they would grow one field and leave another fallow for a season so that the nutrients could replace itself. God wanted Israel to do that with its land, but Israel, becoming greedy, had decided, hey, let's continue growing right through that 7th year, and we'll store up extra stuff for ourselves, and we won't have to rely upon God to bless us. Because what God was doing was causing the land to produce twice as much crops every 6th year, and they take that double amount and use that for the 7th year that they didn't grow the land. So basically, Israel, you know, when you think about it, it's like, well, what's the big harm in growing for the 7th year? A guy got mad at Israel because they weren't following proper farming, principles. No, what the deeper spiritual truth was that Israel was trying to find a way to be able to be self-sufficient, and as they got more and more blessed, they wanted to find a way to phase God out of the system so they wouldn't have to rely upon him, just in case God, who had been always faithful, decided not to be faithful, we wouldn't have to rely upon him. So for a space of 490 years, Israel continued growing, right? It's not like they went 1 or 2 years and then they stopped and went back to resting the land the 7th year. They went 490 straight years violating the law of Moses related to resting the land the 7th year, because they didn't really trust God, even though it always come through. They didn't want to have to rely upon him. They wanted to be self-sufficient. So after the 490 years, God got mad and decided to punish them. And he said, because you have cheated the land out of its Sabbath year's rest for 490 years, what I'm going to do is divide 7. There's that important number of completion again. I'm going to divide 7 into 490, and I'm going to come up with 70 years. So if you take 7 divided into 490 years, you get 70 years. And so God decided, using his, heavenly calculus, that you owe the land 70 years rest, meaning you owe me 70 years rest. And so what God did is use the pagan king Nebuchadnezzar, who was the founder of the neo-Babylonian empire, and used him to take Israel into captivity, and that captivity lasted for how long? For 70 years, to give the land a Sabbath day's rest. And so you can read about that in Jeremiah 25. We'll get to that probably next week as we're going through this series. So, but all of that wasn't just because God cared about, the crops and wanted to make sure the corn could grow at a leisurely pace. What God was doing was giving an opportunity for real human events to give rise to the revelation of Bible prophecy. And Bible prophecy is simply where God takes things that happens in the future, because he's standing above the timeline of all human history, the fall in the Garden of Eden, the second coming of Christ, the millennial reign of Christ. He can see all of that at the same time because he's outside of history. So he was using this as an opportunity to give prophetic passages and prophetic knowledge to a faithful young man by the name of Daniel, so that we that are alive today could read the signs of the times. And we've been talking about how the last year or two, from 2020 into 2021, all kinds of worldwide pandemics have been going on, and it's hearkening to mind. People are talking about the mark of the beast system, it's the rise of the Antichrist, the great reset, the destruction of the American economy and the unity of the world in one. All kinds of things have been happening within the last 12 months, and really in the last 9 to 10 months. Bible prophecy type events have been occurring that have caused people to wonder, are we in the last days? And I would submit to you, yes, we are. And Daniel was given these prophecies 600 years before the birth of Christ. Why? To prepare us to be able to understand the time that we are living in now. It says in Daniel chapter 12 that Daniel was to seal up the prophecies of the book of Daniel until the time of the end. But we find out 600 years later, when the same prophecies were given to John, who wrote the book of Revelation at the behest of the Holy Spirit, he was told, don't seal up the book because the time is at hand, meaning we're now in the end times, and we have been since 96 AD, when John was used to scriven the book of Revelation, and now we've had 2,000 years since then. So, to paraphrase somebody, it's later than it's ever been before as relates to Bible prophecy. So just to give you a little bit of background about Daniel, who was Daniel? Daniel was one of the bright young men in the nation of Israel, along with his 3 friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were the best and brightest young minds in the nation of Israel at the time that God used Nebuchadnezzar to invade Israel, to punish Israel for violating the land's Sabbath day's rest. So God, again, as he's done before in the Bible, uses pagans and unbelievers to invoke and to carry out his own will. So God even uses people that aren't on his side to manipulate them to do his will, even though they don't know they're doing his will for them. And so Nebuchadnezzar was one of those individuals that was used to fulfill the will of God. And so Nebuchadnezzar comes in. What does he do when he comes into the land of Israel? He destroys the temple. And after destroying the temple, Israel didn't have a way to do a sacrifice or to do any of the things that they were commanded to do under the Levitical laws. Additionally, the men that Nebuchadnezzar didn't kill, like the women and the children, he took them as slaves into Babylon. And so Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who also feature prominently in the book of Daniel, are all taken as captives in Babylon. The temple is now destroyed. Israel is now desolate. What God does, though, is he gives favor to his servants. You know, and Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego grew up under the favor of God and ended up becoming great advisors to King Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, Daniel was the founder of a group that eventually became known as the Magi, the guys who could read the signs of the stars to foretell, you know, important events that were going to occur. And it's believed by many Bible scholars that Daniel is the founder of this Magi group that actually was the group that went into Bethlehem at the time of the birth of Christ, because they saw the sign of the star in the east, and because of what they had learned about the God of Israel from Daniel, who founded this group of stargazers in what was ancient Babylon and eventually became Media-Persia, that when they came out of the east, it was because Daniel had alerted them that one day there's going to come a Messiah sent by the God of Israel to save the world, and when that time comes, you go and make friends with him and you'll be doing yourself a favor. And that's what the three Magi thing is all about in the birth of Christ, which we read about in Luke chapter 1 and Luke chapter 2 and the first couple of chapters of the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark and John. So with that being said, Daniel is now an advisor to King Nebuchadnezzar in the land of Babylon because God has given him favor. He has decided to follow a vegetarian diet. He refuses to eat the types of foods and meats that are sacrificed and offered to the Babylonian gods. And even though he wouldn't eat the same diet as the other king's advisors, God made him stronger and better and more handsome looking. And so God realized, or so the people in Babylon realized, that God had given favor to these young Jewish men who were now advisors in the Babylonian kingdom. So as a result of that, what we find out is that God gave Nebuchadnezzar a dream. And we read about this dream in Daniel chapter 2, and I've made a chart that kind of depicts what we saw there. And you know, there is this dream that was had by King Nebuchadnezzar that disturbed him so much that he couldn't sleep. But as oftentimes has happened to us, right, that if you have a dream, if you don't write it down, as soon as you wake up, you might forget about it. And so Nebuchadnezzar had this traumatic dream, but he didn't write it down, and he didn't, you know, and it didn't set it in his long-term memory, and he forgot what the dream was about. He just remembered that it really disturbed him. So what did King Nebuchadnezzar do? He went to his astrologers and soothsayers and spiritual advisors and said, hey, I had this dream, and you guys are on the payroll to tell me what the spiritual implications of these dreams are, so do your job and tell me what the dream is all about. And so they said, okay, King, tell us what the dream is, and we'll interpret it for you. And Nebuchadnezzar, being a smart guy, says, nah, not so fast, my friend. I'm paying you to do the hard work. You tell me what my dream was if you have these supernatural powers that you claim to have, and then after you tell me what my dream was, if you tell me correctly, then you can interpret it for me. And they said, no, King, nobody can do that. So they couldn't tell Nebuchadnezzar what his dream was about, and they certainly couldn't interpret it. So what Nebuchadnezzar said was, if you guys don't figure this out by tomorrow, I'm going to kill all of you and burn your houses to the ground and cover it with animal dung. And so King Nebuchadnezzar was pretty upset because I think he realized that he was being scammed by these astrologers and soothsayers and occultists. And so the occultists who worked for the king were upset. And they went back and they told Daniel, guess what? we're all in trouble. The king's going to kill all of us tomorrow because he gave us an assignment that we can't fulfill. He wants us to interpret a dream without telling us what the dream is about. Now Daniel, who was part of this group, meaning that he was going to get executed too, he said, well, you know what, guys, we got nothing to lose. Let me go talk to the king and see what I can do. And so he goes and talks to the king and says, King, give me a day and I can go and talk to my God, the God of Israel. And, he's a God who's the God of gods. Even though your Babylonian soothsayers and spiritual advisors couldn't get the information from the Babylonian gods, Semiramis and Nimrod, which were being worshipped under different names at this period of time, because my God is the God of gods. And he'll be able to tell me whatever I need to know. So Nebuchadnezzar said, okay, come back to me tomorrow and we'll see. And if not, I'm killing you and I'm killing everybody else in, the cult of the court of the astrologers, and I'm burning your houses to the ground. So Daniel goes back and prays about it, and God reveals to him this dream that Nebuchadnezzar had related to a metallic man. And I've made an artist's depiction of it right here. This is a depiction of what Nebuchadnezzar saw. A metallic man with a head of gold, chest of silver, hips of brass, legs of iron, and feet made of iron mixed with miry or earthly clay. And so it is with that information in store, we pick up the story in Daniel chapter 2. And in Daniel chapter 2, now that you have all the background, you really understand what we're talking about. There's a decree about the dream, and we pick it up in Daniel chapter 2, verse 1. I'm just going to go ahead and read that. Now that you have a little background, you'll be able to follow along and understand what it is that we're talking about. And it says, in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, wherewith his spirit was troubled, and his sleep brake from him. And the king commanded to call the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans to show the king the dreams. So they came before the king. This is to show you that while magicians and sorcerers and occultists can sometimes be able to give some information that they obtained from Satan, at whose behest they work, Satan doesn't know everything and he can't tell them everything because he's not really a god. He's just a powerful fallen angel. And so it says, the king spake to them and said, I have dreamed the dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. Then spake the Chaldeans, the sorcerers and magicians, said, the thing is gone from me. The king said to them, if ye will not make known unto me the dream, well, let's go to verse 4. I've dreamed the dream. He says, then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, which was the language they spoke. He said, O king, live forever. They're trying to flatter him. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show you the interpretation thereof. In other words, tell us what the dream was, and we'll tell you what it means. I mean, anybody can do that. A cheap trick. You can get anybody, tarot card reading person can set up their own booth. Tell me what your dream was, and I'll make up an interpretation for you. And you can't tell whether it was true or not. But King Nebuchadnezzar, being smarter than the average bear, said, no, you're going to tell me what the dream was, and then if you can do that, I'll let you interpret it for me. So the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the magicians, this thing is gone from me, the dream. If ye will not make known unto me the dream, with the interpretation thereof, ye shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. A dunghill means that it's covered with feces, animal and human. He's going to chop them into pieces, tear their houses down, and cover it up with feces, just to show his disdain for their inability to do what they claimed they were able to do. So then we bounce down to verse 14 of Daniel chapter 2, where we pick it up, and it says, then Daniel answered with counsel and wisdom to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, which had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. So the king had sent out an order to his commander-in-chief Arioch, go and kill all the wise men in Babylon. The guys that couldn't interpret the dream were about to get killed. And Daniel got a stay of execution at this point. And verse 15, it says, and he answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, why is this decree so hasty from the king? Then Arioch made this thing known to Daniel. Then Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time, and he would show the king the interpretations. Then Daniel went into his house and made this thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were the Hebrew names of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were the Babylonian names that they were referred to, but they, in their Hebrew names, were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. In other words, Daniel went to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and said, hey, we're the only Jewish kids here in the kingdom. We need to pray and fast that the God of Israel will reveal to us his dream, or else we're all dead men. And Daniel went to his house, made this thing known to them, and then that they would desire the mercies of God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Notice the wise men of Babylon couldn't interpret the dream. So it was the 4 Jewish kids, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that had a little prayer meeting and besought the face of God to reveal the dream so that their lives could be spared, and inadvertently the lives of all the Chaldeans as well. Verse 19, it says, then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. In other words, God revealed that very same night what the dream was all about, showing you that he is a supernatural being that can see into the future, and it was in fact him that gave the dream to Nebuchadnezzar, so that Nebuchadnezzar could give it to Daniel, and so that Daniel could interpret it and tell us what this dream meant related to the kingdoms of the world leading up to the rise of the Antichrist and the end of human history, which will be ended with the second coming of Christ and the millennial reign of Jesus on the earth. All of that laid out about 2,600 years ago in the form of a dream of King Nebuchadnezzar, so that we here, 2,600 years later, will be able to see that we are indeed in the last of the last days, and that the second coming of Christ is about to give rise to the millennial reign of Christ on the earth and the establishment of the kingdom of heaven here on the earth. So, it's with that we continue on. Verse 26, Daniel is now going to reveal this dream to the king. And the king answered and said to Daniel, well, verse 19, it says, then was the secret revealed to Daniel in a night vision, then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Verse 26, the king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar. So, in the Syriac, Chaldean or Babylonian tongue, Daniel is referred to as Belteshazzar. So that's how Nebuchadnezzar would refer to him. Using the name of their god. At this time, the Babylonians were worshiping God under the name of Bel. Nimrod established this false worship in ancient Babylon. Now in neo-Babylon, Baal was the god that, that they worship. We have a holiday in witchcraft, even to this day in the springtime, called Beltane. That's taken from the name of the ancient Babylonian Sumerian god Bel, B-E-L. And so Belteshazzar, like servant of Bel, is what Nebuchadnezzar will refer to Daniel. But Daniel's name in Hebrew, Daniel, was like, God is my judge, meaning the God of Israel, El, is my judge. And so, you can learn a thing or two from a name. What's in a name? A whole lot of stuff. So, in verse 27, we find out that Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men and the astrologers and the magicians and the soothsayers show the king, but there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets and maketh known to the king what shall be in the latter days. So Daniel's saying, look, all these magicians and soothsayers don't have any real power, but there's a God in heaven, and I know him, he's the God of Israel, and he can reveal the future, and even your dream can be revealed. And so then he says, thy dream and the vision that I heard upon thy bed are these. And he goes on to say, thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. And again, here's my artist depiction of that very same thing. And I've made this available for you so you can take a look at it. Here is depiction of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar dreamed about and that Daniel interpreted. The metallic man dream of Daniel. Head of gold, chest of silver, hips of brass, legs of iron, feet of iron and miry clay. And so he goes on to say that the image's head was of fine gold, his breast and arms of silver, his belly and thighs of brass, his legs of iron, and his feet of iron and part clay. Thou sawest until a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, which smote the image on its feet that were made of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like chaff of the summer threshing floor, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone which smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This is the dream, and now we will tell ye the interpretation thereof before the king. So, Nebuchadnezzar had this weird dream. This metallic man image got hit on the feet by a stone, depicted right here, and when it did, it all decayed into dust, and after decaying into dust, it blew away, and the stone grew up and filled the whole world. And so, that's a strange dream. This stone became a great mountain that filled the whole earth. Now Daniel is about to tell him what all this actually, really, and truly means. And so we get the benefit of Daniel having received information from the God of heaven about what this dream really is telling us. And so now Daniel is going to interpret. And so we'll pick it up, Daniel chapter 2, and again, we're picking up now verse 37. And the interpretation is shocking. When you understand what it is that Daniel's actually saying, we find out this is a shocking bit of truth. And so we find out then that Daniel says this is the interpretation, and what he's doing is he's going to establish the fact that there are 4 world empires that are represented by this metallic man that is being dreamed about, and that the final of those 4 kingdoms would be in existence, disappear, come back into existence, and that this final form of the 4th kingdom would include human beings with non-human beings. I know that sounds scandalous and crazy, but follow the verses for me and hear me out. Because what Daniel is saying about that 4th empire is that the kingdom that's going to be ruling on the face of the earth at the time Jesus comes back to establish his millennial reign on the earth will be a kingdom that not only includes human beings, but it's going to be dominated by non-human beings. So humans and non-humans will be combined together to establish a kingdom that will control the whole world, and that is the kingdom that Jesus comes back to destroy. And so he says, Thou, O king, art a king of kings. For the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, strength, and glory, and whosoever the children, or wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the fields, the fowls of heaven hath he given into thy hand, and hath made thee ruler over all. Thou art the head of gold. So in other words, what Daniel is saying is that it was God himself that gave Nebuchadnezzar the power to become, at that point in time, the greatest king anywhere on the face of the earth, and that all of these other individuals are part and parcel of his kingdom. The birds of the air are under his authority. And so God has, given favor to Nebuchadnezzar, and eventually Nebuchadnezzar, as it turns out, becomes a believer. You can read elsewhere, we're not going to have time to look at it today, but elsewhere, God allowed a curse to fall on Nebuchadnezzar, where it seems to suggest that he turned into some kind of hybridized beast for a space of 7 years, and Daniel took care of him, and after that time was over, he became a believer in the God of Israel. So when we get to heaven, for those of you that are already born again, when we're raptured, the dead in Christ will rise first, and then we who are alive and remain, we'll get caught up in the clouds to meet the Lord. We should be able to see the spirit of Nebuchadnezzar up in heaven waiting for his resurrection as well, because he apparently became a believer in the God of Israel. So Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, you're the head of gold, and your kingdom is the greatest that will ever be. And then after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee. And that was the chest of silver, which was the Media-Persian Empire. Persia took over from Babylon after Nebuchadnezzar left the throne. And Persia united with a smaller empire that they had been at war with, and they united together with the Median Empire. The Median Empire united together with Persia to form Media-Persia, but Persia was much bigger and more dominant, so Media was a very small part of that empire, but it became collectively known as Media-Persia. And so then Daniel goes on to talk about the third kingdom. There shall rise after thee another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. The kingdom of brass is making reference to what? The Grecian Empire of Alexander the Great. Moved faster than anyone in the history of the world to take over the world. Alexander the Great was very powerful, but he was of less influence and scope than the Babylonian Empire of Nebuchadnezzar and the Persian Empire that took over from Babylon. So he explains that the third kingdom, the kingdom of brass, was Greece. And then he goes on to say that there'll be a fourth kingdom, and it shall be strong as iron. For as much as iron breaketh into pieces, and subdueth all things, and as iron breaketh all these, shall it break in pieces and bruise. So now he's talking about this fourth kingdom, which I've depicted here in the metallic man, and notice it has two legs. Most Bible prophecy scholars would agree that this is making reference to the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire, interestingly enough, eventually divided. It was headquartered in Rome at one time, and then it eventually got separated out into two different branches. One to the east, which was at Byzantium, which was renamed for Emperor Constantine as Constantinople, and the western branch, which was based in the city of Rome. So again, the leg of this metallic man, there are two legs, which would suggest that this fourth empire has two components, the east and the west. Most people, and I think most competent Bible scholars, would say that is the Roman Empire. And it says this fourth kingdom shall, be stronger than all the others and diverse from all the rest. And then in verse 41, he says something very interesting. And he says, and whereas that thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of iron, for as much as thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, and as the toes and feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And so, again, you've got the Roman Empire that did already divide into the east and the western branches, and then the Roman Empire, which was never defeated by any enemy. It's not like they went to war with the Etruscans and lost. They just sort of dissolved into decay because of corruption, political and sexual depredation, and eventually the Goths and the Visigoths, the barbarians from Britannia, kind of sort of took over, and the Roman Empire sort of receded into fallen back status, and eventually the Roman Church that had been established during the Roman Empire took over, and it became sort of a religious facet of itself. And so I would submit to you that the Roman Empire continues on today in the form of the Roman Catholic Church based in the Vatican in Rome, and that it controls a lot more than what we give it credit for, and eventually it will coalesce again into a united one real empire divided into 10 subsections. So again, we find out that Daniel says this fourth empire has feet, and the feet are part of iron, but part of miry clay. And when you look at the Syriac interpretation of that, the miry clay interpretation can also be interpreted or translated earthly clay. It is the contention of a number of impressive Bible prophecy scholars that I've followed over the years, and it is my opinion as well, that this reference to the feet of the Iron Empire is suggesting that this empire will be revived again and will be on the earth at the time that the Messiah returns, and that this empire will be made up of iron, very strong, and miry clay, earthly clay. Another interpretation might be that the strong ones that are a part of this Roman revived empire will be non-humans, and they will combine genetically together with human DNA, so that the toes and the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And the reason why I buy into the human alien hybrid hypothesis is the verses that follow up. So again, the hypothesis that I'm promoting and that others like Dave Hunt and Chuck Missler have promoted is that the kingdom of the Antichrist, to be clear, will be a revival of the Roman Empire that gave us all of the Caesars and gave us the Roman Colosseum and gave us the gladiator matches. That will revive again in the last days. But when it revives again, not only will it be the powerful Roman Empire, it'll be even more powerful because it will have as a component of it non-humans who are supermen. Fallen angels will now have been, just like in Genesis chapter 6, been able to superimpose their genetic material with human DNA to create a hybridized group of people that will be on the earth. And I say that because of what we read in verse 43 of Daniel chapter 2. So now we get to that very strange, mysterious 43rd verse of Daniel chapter 2, and I would invite those of you guys that are at home, turn to your Bibles, and you guys can look and read that as well and see what the interpretation and what the root meaning of, that word is. And it says this, and it says in verse 43, "And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave to one another, even as iron is not mixed with clay." It's that verse. When you sit down and break that down, that could be a 2-hour teaching in and of itself. But let's sit down and take a look at that and see what is it that they're saying. Well, let's first off realize that they're using the personal pronoun they, speaking of a plurality of individuals, person, place, or thing. Apparently, this verse is making reference to a plurality of persons, and these persons are not human because they are mingling together with people that are human. And so we'll read that again. "And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry, which can be also interpreted earthly or earthling clay." Remember, God made Adam's body out of what? Out of the dust of the ground, made it out of clay. Adam's body was made from clay, and then God breathed into it the breath of life and became a living being. Is it possible that in the last days, the science of biogenetic engineering has advanced to the point where, and we know this is already true and it has been for decades, that you can take human DNA, combine it together with animal DNA, and make a hybrid chimera, is what they refer to it as. A chimera is a combination of one kind or type of organism with another kind or type of organism to create a third kind or type of organism that never existed in nature. And it's that type of thing that God was condemning in the book of Leviticus. Men couldn't have sexual relations with other men, but they also couldn't have sexual relations with animals and beasts. And when that would happen, you know what you would do? You would not only would you stone to death the man that engaged in bestiality, but strangely enough, under the law of Moses, you would have to kill the animal too. Why? Because though God has built in a biogenetic barrier to make it much more difficult for human beings to be interfertile with non-human animals, the possibility remains. And I would submit to you, that is exactly why when you look out through Greek mythology, Norse mythology, and particularly Egyptian mythology, you see the gods that were worshipped by the people were oftentimes, almost in every case, part animal and part human. You know, Horus was the falcon-headed god, had a human body and the head of a falcon. And then you had, Anubis, which was the jackal-headed god. He had the body of a man, the head of a jackal, like the dog ears, we had the long snout, dog ears, and then you had others who had claws or feet. In Hinduism, who do you have? Lord Ganesha. Lord Ganesha, the elephant-headed god, part human with the head of an elephant. Why do we see these things over and over again? Well, if you guys take a look at Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, we find out that all mythology, whether it be Greek mythology, I was just, looking at a movie and I remember reading the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer and Virgil, talking about, these gods and goddesses that came down and interacted with men to create these hybridized supermen, like Achilles was a demigod. He was part human and part god, and so he was the greatest warrior of all times. And Ajax, another part human and part celestial being. And then the Greeks had their Hercules, who was supposedly the son of the sky god Zeus with a human woman. And then in Scandinavia, you had Thor, who was the son of Odin, who was the chief all-father god of heaven, who was the offspring of Odin and a human female who gave birth to Thor, the god of thunder. So we have in every culture historical or mythological references to these supermen who were either called heroes by individuals like Homer or Virgil, which is where we get our comic book term superheroes, which is really just a retelling of these ancient mythological tales of human supermen. And we have it in every culture, and they have different names and different traditions, but we have the same concept that the gods came down, dwelt with human women, had sexual relations with them, and created hybridized offspring who were greater and more powerful than the greatest human warriors or soldiers. And we find out from Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, that all of mythology, whether it be Greek mythology, Scandinavian mythology, Roman mythology, ancient Sumerian mythology, whether it's talking about, Achilles or Thor or Hercules or Atlas, these individuals, according to Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, actually did exist, and stories were written about them. And it says, these were the mighty men of old, men of what? Renown, meaning that they were so famous that people wrote stories about them. That's why you have the Iliad and the Odyssey. That's why you have Homer and Virgil writing about these super god men that supposedly were the offspring of gods that came down to the earth to interact with us. That's why you have Marvel comics and DC comics nowadays. You have all of that according to Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, because once upon a time in the world's history, they actually did exist upon the earth. And according to Daniel chapter 2, verse 43, it is my supposition, and it is agreed to by Chuck Missler, Dave Hunt, much greater Bible prophecy scholars than I'll ever be, that this verse is suggesting that this last day's kingdom of the Antichrist will include human beings working alongside non-human beings, both of whom are persons. One is a normal person, a son of Adam, the children of men, alongside a superhuman who is not fully a son of Adam, because he's also an offspring of a celestial being who disguises himself as a god, but really isn't. In reality, these are the fallen angels that I have depicted right here in our timeline chart. The fallen angels came down and interacted with human women to create a whole race of supermen. And it was because of that and their threat to the human race that God had to destroy the whole world with a flood. Not because he was angry about sin. He was angry about sin, but that's not the reason, because there's still sin in the world, and he doesn't destroy the world every day when people sin every day. So, Daniel chapter 2, verse 43, key and foundational to understanding the prophecy that Daniel is giving related to the rise of the kingdom of the